Welcome to the Wild Harvest Initiative, changing the narrative for North American hunters. My name is Andrew McKean, and I'll be your moderator for what I expect to be a fascinating presentation and discussion on an idea that's been gaining traction around the world. We have about 60 minutes together. I encourage you to participate at any time by submitting questions through the Q&A tab. If you notice at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see it. But we'll get to your questions at the end. So you can ask them at any time, but then we'll save some time at the end so that you can engage in this, what I expect to be a great dialogue with the panelists. So to that end, I'd like to introduce the panelists for this evening's discussion. Gray Thornton serves as president and chief executive of the Wild Sheep Foundation, as well as the journalist to me is required to say this, the editor-in-chief of Wild Sheep magazine. Prior to joining WSF in 2008, Gray served as executive director of the Dallas Safari Club, and before that, as membership director for Safari Club International. He's a passionate mountain hunter and an articulate spokesman for conservation, and needs all of our accolades for a job well done with Sheep Week this week. Shane Patrick Mahoney, our other panelist, is the president and CEO of Conservation Visions Incorporated. He lives in Newfoundland, and he has over 30 years experience in pretty much every aspect of wildlife management, scientific research, policy innovator, and as service as a strategic advisor. But you know him as a great communicator. He's a filmmaker, a lecturer, a narrator for television and radio, all in service to increase the public understanding of the principles of conservation and to compel greater interest in, and I would say advocacy for, the natural world and sustainable wildlife populations. One of Shane's principal pursuits lately has been what he calls the Wild Harvest Initiative. It's a deeply researched examination of our collective harvest of wild protein and how the pursuit of meat shapes our culture, communities, economies, and even our bodies. Before we get right into it, I think I'm excited to see this topic today because I think it's got a newfound momentum. It's been an idea that's been cooking for, I think Shane said, about 5 years, but it's taken on heightened relevance this year as more North Americans than ever have found solace and health, I guess, both psychic and physical, in the outdoors. But also there's been some anxieties, global food insecurity, the meaning of our human communities and connections, and the strength of our economies. So as you hear from Shane, each of these anxieties can be linked to a loss of connection with wild food. Shane, in the likely case that I have totally mischaracterized this, what is wild harvest? And the floor is yours, gentlemen.
Well, before I jump right into that, I do believe that my colleague here, Mr. Gray Thornton, wants to say at least one or two short words. I understand.
Hello, my friend. Good to see you. If this is what our world is now, but you know, I do have something that I think is a critically important thing to say. And that is a little bit of a pint. And you know, Shane, I wish you and I were here together and enjoying a good pint of Guinness. I don't know if I got the head proper. I know you would do fancy shamrock and some other artwork on there. But you know, you and I have shared beers and other beverages in Russia and South Africa and Eastern and Western Europe and in your beautiful Newfoundland. And admittedly, we've shared a few in some much less glamorous places. But you know, Shane, looking forward to this seminar, and here's to you, my friend. Good to see you.
The same, Gray. All the best. Well, the Wild Harvest Initiative is, in one sense, nothing new or earth-shattering. And in another sense, it is something that I believe has the capacity to transform the hunting movement, but also hopefully to transform much more widely our impressions of landscapes and ecosystems from a human point of view. I have a few slides that I want to show, but I won't waste too much time on them because hopefully we will be able to get to a point of dialogue in this shared exchange as soon as possible. But it is important to point out some of the salient aspects that led me to consider this as a way forward for the conservation movement in North America and, in fact, around the world. Hopefully, everyone can see this screen. Is that the case, Greg? Can you see it, for example?
Mhm.
Yeah. So the title of the presentation aims at the very heart of what I'm hoping will be the outcome of it, which is that we have to consider changing the narrative for North American hunting. We need to borrow from the strengths of the past, but we also have to realize that we are living in a very different world, very different society. And just because we cherish a certain way of life and a certain activity, a certain cultural dimension, that does not mean that this way of life and this cultural dimension can be maintained forever. Nor simply because some of us care deeply about wildlife does it naturally follow that all of society will do so, and that our governments, for example, will enlist legislation and policies around the world that will safeguard the extraordinary diversity on this planet, both the diversity that we share indirectly through our harvesting and the diversity that's part of building ecosystems and ensuring that the species we do harvest are able to thrive and exist. We cannot separate the idea of harvest, in fact, from human history at any scale. Human beings in our present form have existed for about 200,000 years. And of course, we emerged as any other species with requirements for food and developed adaptations by which we could obtain that food. And they changed over time. We recognize too that in the harvest of food, extraordinarily powerful cultural identity is transmitted by peoples all over the world. In this iconic image here, of course, for North Americans, a Plains Indian hunting the bison on horseback is one of the most recognizable images in our cultural history. The talent that it took for these individuals and these communities to be able to harvest these beasts and survive on the land is, of course, something that gives us inspiration today, and in part is what motivates the modern hunter to go out and search for food in their own circumstance. Native Americans have been on the land for somewhere around 13,000 to maybe 15,000 or so years before Europeans came here. And over all that time, over those 13 to 15 millennia, 15,000 years, despite constant interaction with the wildlife of this continent, when Europeans did arrive, they were simply mesmerized by the amount of wildlife that existed. And of course, there were millions and millions and millions of Native Americans residing on this wild food at that time, giving proof at a very early stage, although it was not recognized at that time, giving proof at a very early stage that sustainable harvests of wildlife were in fact quite possible for human cultures. The advent of European colonization and the building of the railroads and the opening up of the country and the opportunities for marketing dead wildlife, both in Europe and to markets in the American East and parts of Canada, open up a tremendous opportunity economically for a great number of people. And the end result of that, and also a belief that the land should be turned over to agriculture and taken from wildlife, led to massive, massive takings of individual species. And in this collage of photographs, of course, you see the man sitting on the buffalo hides, another individual standing next to a mountain of bison skulls, a massive harvest in the lower left corner of waterfowl, and then, of course, a massive shipment of bison bones that were destined to be ground and used for a variety of purposes. These images that focus on waterfowl and Bison, of course, could have been repeated. We could have shown images of elk, black bear, a variety of other species, white-tailed deer. Many of the iconic species that we have today were simply eliminated during a period of about 150 years of essentially unrestrained taking. Bearing in mind that we can leave malice out of the equation, most of the people who were engaged in this activity were looking to make money and pursue a way of life, the American dream in a sense. And they also were weighted down by the belief that the abundance of North America was so incredible that there could be absolutely no way of believing that we could harvest it to death, essentially. The result, of course, of this massive undertaking and destruction of wildlife was that eventually it did become obvious that we were taking far too much from the land and that something had to be done. There was either going to be no wildlife left at all, or there was going to have to be some kind of effort made to encourage some kind of ethic new to North Americans about how to protect wildlife. And what happened in the period between, say, the late 1880s and about 1920, 1930, was one of the great transformations in American society. Because against all the promotional ideas of subduing the land and taking wildlife onto ourselves, there emerged a brand new kind of idea. And that brand new kind of idea was that we should look at the harvesting of wildlife as a renewable resource, something that we should protect for future generations, and something that we should actively engage in protecting and conserving at the same time that we harvested it. And of course, this image here of volunteers and perhaps some staff of the Wild Sheep Foundation doing the work that it does in helping to translocate sheep, to rebuild populations that were decimated. This is a classic example of the kind of advocacy, volunteerism, and activism that was demonstrated by a plethora of organizations and individuals that emerged to counteract this massive decimation of wildlife that had been occurring. And so we might show in other circumstances images of organizations that might do this with elk or with turkey or with other species. But this is a classic example of what was meant by actively engaging in the conservation of wildlife and for purposes that transcended the individual's use and was designed to preserve wildlife for future generations. The issue of harvest, however, the issue of harvest never fell away. And this is a very interesting and important point. When the decimation of wildlife was first noticed, and when there began to be a reaction to it and a decision that we would have to do something different to safeguard wildlife, the equation should have been relatively simple. We were killing so many wild animals that what we really had to do was stop killing them altogether, and then that would have been the solution to the problem. But what happened was that we actually turned, thanks to men, innovative men such as Theodore Roosevelt and George Bird Grinnell and a host of others, and with help from groups like the Boone and Crockett Club, we actually turned that harvesting of wildlife, that wild harvest, into essentially the fulcrum, the linchpin by which wildlife recovery and management would be secured in the future. It is hard for those of us today, looking back on the circumstances of the 1910s and 1920s, when most of our iconic species would have actually been threatened or endangered in their status, that some group of people would have come up with the idea that said, no, let's not stop harvesting wildlife. Let's make wild harvesting the very center of bringing those populations back. Today, in a much more modern and different world, it is often easy for people to forget that still, globally, billions of people worldwide harvest their food by taking from nature, by capturing, killing, and consuming wild living species. whether this is through hunting and angling as we know it in the recreational sense, or whether it is still even at a commercial level, where obviously commercial fisheries feed almost 1/3 of the world. So therefore, one can see that harvesting and humanity, going all the way back several 100,000 years, is still being played out in a forceful way in the 21st century, seemingly propositioning us with an inescapable relationship between humans and wild things. It is interesting that when you think about food, you don't just think about a meal. You think about the issues that are listed on this slide, which are issues that pertain to food security, to human health, to economic stability, to the maintenance of cultures, to the preservation of environmental circumstances, because we cannot have healthy wildlife populations if we do not have healthy environments. We know as well, within the North American context in particular, that there are changes taking place. And societal change is a very important issue in discussing the Wild Harvest Initiative from many perspectives. One perspective, which is alarming, is of course that the participation rates in hunting and angling have largely been declining since the 1980s. Now, we have seen in the COVID phenomenon a resurgence of these activities, and hopefully that will last. But prior to that, there certainly was a decline. And between 2011 and 2016, the United States lost about 2.2 million hunters. And we have to realize that the basis of the North American model, the basis of the state agency processes, and the basis, of course, of the funding that comes to NGOs like Wild Sheep Foundation are generated largely through the expenditures and the activities of hunters and anglers, depending on what organization we are talking about. That's not all of it, but it is a significant, highly significant majority source of funding for our state agencies, which of course in the United States and our provincial agencies in Canada have responsibility primarily for managing most wildlife species. But hunting's modern relevance can only be maintained if we have one absolutely crucial factor working for us. Hunters represent, and even hunters and anglers, hunters represent about 4 to 4.5% of the American and Canadian population. If we add in anglers, we might be up to 10 or 12%. But collectively, we're a minority, and everyone accepts that. There's nothing particularly bad or good necessarily about that, but it is a fact. And therefore, public support is essential to maintaining the future of this activity in a democracy where decisions are made by elected governments to determine what will be acceptable and what will not be acceptable in society. And hunting benefits hunters. We know that, both because they get to exercise the things they love and because of the food that they acquire. But we also need to recognize the fact that hunting and the harvest of wildlife influence human food security, human health in the broader sense, in terms of time spent in the outdoors, that there's a direct connection between wild harvesting and wildlife, fish, and habitat conservation. And in fact, the wild harvesting of animals plays directly to social concerns around animal welfare and animal health. Because the animals that are hunted are animals that live their entire lives in the natural systems for which they evolved. They are free. And only, yes, at the moment of death are they taken away from that system, but for maybe 10 or 12 or 15 years or 30 years, depending on the species involved, the animal lives wild and unrestrained and free. And in fact, lives under the circumstances of the finest animal welfare circumstances that one might imagine. They are the natural circumstances for the animal. And the benefits of hunting, because of the contributions that are made, benefit the environment. And we all have heard, we have too little time here, but we have all heard about the tremendous economic expenditures that come as a result of hunting activity in Canada and the United States. So these kinds of ideas, this kind of intersection of the human past, distance, and the relatively recent past that gave rise to the North American model, and the maintenance of these activities today of harvesting, means that this whole idea of taking from nature is something that is very deep in the human being, but it is something that brings extraordinary benefits to the wider society. Now, we have a lot of examples of where individuals and entities celebrate very well individual game dinners or individual activities where they celebrate a particular harvest amongst friends and family and so on. The Wild Harvest Initiative, however, is not like that. The Wild Harvest Initiative certainly includes those kinds of happenings, meals, serving wild food, and so on and so forth. But it is not a project. It is not an event. What the Wild Harvest Initiative is a narrative changing program. We are trying to redefine the relationship between harvesting and modern human beings in our countries in a relentless kind of way that seeks to work with the changes that are taking place in society rather than arguing against them. If you think back, many of the controversial positions we have had to take with regard to hunting we have been in debates over with people who, for example, are not in favor perhaps of hunting or who do not like hunting. And we try to convince others that they should think the way we think. But an incredible phenomenon has been taking place in societies around the world for the last 10 to 20 years, which is a growing concern for the quality of life, for the quality of food, and for knowledge of the sources from which our food comes. This trend has been increasing. It is not a fad. It is taking place in cultures all over the world, and it's real. And the Wild Harvest Initiative, the idea of harvesting clean, beautiful, wild food in all its forms, is an attempt to align our history, our motivations, our way of life as wild harvesters with this wider change that is taking place out there in society. We want to link our energy, our beliefs, our way of life with the changes that are already taking place in society, and by doing so, to move our way of life forward. This was the thinking behind the Wild Harvest Initiative. How do we create something that runs with the winds of change and is not trying to stand against the winds of change? Just as the early founders of the model turned harvesting as the solution to the decimation of wildlife, rather than choosing to end wild harvesting as the solution to that problem. We have real objectives in this program, and it's a big program. We want to quantify the amount of wild meat and fish procured annually by recreational hunters and anglers in the United States and Canada. It's hard for us to believe, Greg, you and I have talked about this before. It's hard for us to believe that in 2020, this is, it's never been done. It's never been done before. We would have thought we knew this. We want to determine the economic value of the legally harvested wildlife and fish in Canada and the United States, and its use as food. So we want to understand how much are the millions and millions and millions of pounds of wild meat and fish actually worth. Let's give it a value so that society understands this is not meaningless. This is real food that can serve to replace food that we are otherwise buying, and in fact does for many families. We want to understand the sharing aspects of this. One of the great phenomenons about wild harvesting of all kinds, berries, wild honey, meat, fish, it doesn't make any difference. One of the immutable aspects of this kind of activity is we want to share it with one another. We don't go to the grocery store and buy a roast and give it to our neighbor. We don't go to the grocery store and buy a bag of potatoes and give it to our neighbor. If we raise the food ourselves, or if we hunt the food ourselves and harvest the food from the wild, we do this. Well, how many people do we do this with? How many people do the 40 million or so hunters and anglers in Canada and the United States every year, how many people do they share that food with? And why is that question important? That question is important because if they share it with a very large number of people, we know that that 40 million activists who partake in that activity are now joined by a sort of orbiting group of people who obviously support to some extent that kind of activity, or they wouldn't be consuming the food that they're given. And of course, there's also the beautiful issue of sharing this food with people who are disadvantaged in our communities. But we want to go further and are going further. We want to know, with all this harvested wild food, what about we stopped it? What about we ended this harvest completely? What would be the cost of replacing this food with standard kind of agricultural practices, replacing it with, beef, chicken, or farmed salmon and things of this nature? Ultimately, what we want to demonstrate is what we have been taking for granted for so long could very much be a main part of the food systems of our countries. And if we turned our science and our minds to it, we could actually increase the production of our lands to create even far more wild food. The idea of this then is to encourage, through the use of food and the capture of wild food and the sharing of wild food, a message that we already know the American and Canadian publics are ready to receive. Every survey that we have conducted in Canada and the United States since the 1950s has given clear indication that the general public of the two countries will support hunting if the harvest involves the consumption of the animal thereafter. In other words, if the meat is used. We don't even need to run new surveys. We've had these surveys run since the 1950s and they've been consistent. So we have an argument here for hunting that can be the core argument for its benefits to society, the provisioning of food for the hunters themselves and their families, but for their friends and other people in society. And at the same time, of course, we can also say that hunters have other motivations behind food, and that's fine. But a primary focal point is food, and we all need food. The idea too around this is to build the most emphatic natural ally system that is possible for hunting. All of the images that you see on this screen, the berry pickers, the mushroom foragers, the firewood collectors, the shed antler collectors, the wild beekeepers, the medicinal herb and plant gatherers, and even cattle ranchers raising their stock under wild circumstances, and many, many, many more. These are all possible allies in a movement to take wild harvesting to be central to the policies of conservation movements in Canada and the United States. And I will add to this that eventually that list will also include the harvest of wild beauty. Because I believe every single hunter, every single bird watcher, every single person gathering wildflowers, every single person who's out there testing the berries like those young children in the bottom or harvesting mushrooms, every single one of them in their daily experiences of field undertaking those activities are also with their eyes, with their hearts, with their souls. They are actually harvesting wild beauty. And that wild beauty is giving them a sense of health and a sense of proportion. And we cannot win the conservation debate alone. We absolutely have to have allies. And around wild food, I think we can build the strongest alliances possible. The fact that this idea has some merit is reflected in the extraordinary and growing collection of sponsors and partners who are now involved in this. The Wild Sheep Foundation was, of course, one of the very first to join this. And Gray Thornton made an announcement at a Guides and Outfitters of British Columbia banquet when this thing was just in its infancy, when it was just being talked about. And the Wild Sheep Foundation has stayed in that process ever since and done many, many things to help advance this cause, including talking to others and encouraging them to be a part of this. The strength of this idea is reinforced by the fact that even in the COVID year, since March of this year, the Government Agency of Alaska, the Government Agency of Wyoming, and the Wild Sheep Foundation of Alaska have all joined in the midst of COVID At a time when it has been difficult to build alliances, this particular alliance continues to grow. And we are now in the process of actually talking to a variety of people about the possibilities of moving this into South Africa, Namibia, and other places. And in fact, we are also discussing this with the governments in Hungary and the United Arab Emirates. There's a tremendous amount of international interest in this program now. What we are hoping to do is to break down boundaries with this effort and to simply and ultimately explain to people, look, it is the land. It is the land itself that matters most. And if we treat the land properly, there's room for all of us to harvest and to eat wild and to live free and to support one another in making sure that those landscapes are preserved forever. Now, I'm just going to jump out of this platform and show a very short film that sort of shows some of the imagery, some of the ideas that we are talking about with respect to this, and then turn it over to my very good friend, Gray Thornton. Oh. Excuse me. Get this back. There we go. Small glitch there. Here we go.
About 10,000 years ago, early humans began to cultivate the land and create permanent settlements. Food security increased, allowing our human ancestors to grow swiftly in numbers and spread across the globe. In more recent history, advances in agricultural technology have distanced the majority of people from direct engagement in food acquisition. Despite this relatively newfound freedom, the harvest and consumption of meat from wild game and fish has remained an integral part of the human story through the entirety of our existence. About 40 million citizens participate every year in recreational hunting and fishing. That's 40 million individuals who are personally motivated to make the effort to harvest protein from our forests, fields, lakes, and streams. What compels them out of doors in the uncomfortable and often strenuous attempt to procure game? Is it necessity, tradition, taste preferences, the desire to participate in some form of conservation? Wild meat and fish is always free range, always organic, and always humanely grown. The ultimate ethical, local food. Wild game is the meat that made us human. There is something very human, very culturally significant, not just about harvesting food by one's own hand, but also about still having the freedom to do so. A naturally grown wild harvest feeding millions annually. This is one of the best reasons why land and wildlife conservation matter. We care about what is important to us. We conserve what we care about. And there is nothing more important to our survival than food. It, like our wild harvest, remains fundamental to life.
So that, I think, in a very quick overview, gives you some idea of a program that I believe will make a massive difference for the future of the way of life we love, and also for the wild creatures that make this world worth living in, frankly. Over to you, Gray.
Thank you, Shane. I think it's important to articulate why the Wild Sheep Foundation would get involved in this program so early and also so quickly. And I'll bring you all back to 1993. I think it was in Melbourne, Australia, and I was giving a paper to a group. And it was a symposium. The symposium was called Hunting 2000. And I gave a paper on how to win the hearts and minds. That was my thought of that, that non-hunting majority. Interesting enough, a lot of parallels to today, but it was shortly after a rather surprising US presidential election, at least the results were. And my premise and my hypothesis, Shane, was that we needed to hire Madison Avenue firms. We needed to hire those that were shaping public opinion. We needed to quit talking and speaking and saying the words that our choir understands and feels, yes, you know, those are the comment, yeah, that's right on. And you know, quite frankly, I said, you know, we need to hire those people that elect presidents and prime ministers. And that we engage them to help us. You know, those were the early 1990s. Much has changed. I mean, the internet has changed. It was in its infancy there. We didn't have smartphones. We certainly didn't have social media, and we didn't have the power of big tech back then. The challenge is that the mediums of how we express our thought, you know, how we share thought, how we shape public opinions, those mediums have changed. We all know that. You speak of that. I think the sad thing is, though, our message has not. We still, and we still talk of, and they're all true, that if it pays, it stays, and that hunters pay for conservation. All true. All of those are true facts. But for 30, probably even 40 years, they've fallen on deaf ears. And what's sad is that we're still talking about this. We're still talking about how we can change the hearts and minds of the 70, the 80, the 90% in the middle. And you and I have talked about this a number of times. You know, the 5% pro, the 5% anti, and the rest of them kind of don't care. And you've made very good points that I think are also poignant. That surprisingly, for the last 20 or 30 years, that in the middle still has remained constant. So at least we're doing something right. You and I have been on committees to address this challenge. You know, how do we change the narrative? There's even been new organizations that have been formed.
Yep.
But quite frankly, and I think you know you would agree that to date few have accomplished their objectives, although noble. You came up with this Wild Harvest Initiative, and you know there's a local VOR, there's the interest in wild meat, wild game, healthy food, eating better. You were an innovator, and as you pointed out in the beginning of this seminar, that you know Wild Sheep Foundation is an innovator, and like this platform that we've brought, our Sheep Week the Experience, with a virtual expo and what we're doing in the evenings, you know, we are early adopters, and we saw, and I certainly saw, but we saw your vision. And felt that it was a new narrative and a game changer, and I'm convinced that it is. So that is why the Wild Sheep Foundation got on board early, and that is why the Wild Sheep Foundation has stayed one of the most ardent supporters of this initiative. and quite frankly, a major funder of this initiative. And we're very, very pleased to see the growth, pleased to see new partners come on board, and especially pleased to see which are our partners. It's how we do our work, state agencies. And I hope we get some provincial agencies and ministries in this initiative as our partners there in Canada. But Shane, that's, I'm anxious to just visit with you, and I think there's some questions. I know Andrew will feed some our way, but that's why Wild Sheep Foundation is involved in this. It's obvious that in the dynamic of sheep, although the game meat is so important, and when I harvested my first Dall ram in the Brooks Range, one of the things that I wanted to do most was go back down to our spike camp and grab a willow branch and build a fire and do what I had seen and heard, for many, many years, and grill some ribs over that fire. That was so important to me. But in our world too, how we raise money, how the wild sheep economy works. It's a little different for the Wild Sheep Foundation to be able to, and us to articulate that some of our members are spending $100 to $200 to $300 to almost $400,000 or $500,000 for meat. So, we have our own dynamics that we'll deal with. And I saw a question on the allocation of tags, and it's a good one, and I hope we can address it. But Shane, that's why the Wild Sheep Foundation is involved in this. This is a game changer. This is a narrative changer. And this is something that I wish, we were talking about 30 years ago when I was in Melbourne, Australia.
Well, thank you, Gray. When you start out with a new idea, you sometimes wonder, are you fooling yourself? Have you got it wrong? You question yourself a little bit. But I have to say that the pageant of dialogue and interest and support that has arisen around this has convinced me that this is the way forward. And I say this because I ask myself a question from the point of view of hunting alone. If we cannot convince a broader society that hunting is acceptable for this reason, then what other reason are we going to be able to come up with to convince the broad majority of society that it is acceptable?
Right.
Secondly, there are, as I point out in all of those images, there are all of these other activities in nature, harvesting of berries and harvesting of firewood and harvesting of shed antlers, all those things. And they all share things in common. Obviously, you're outdoors when you do them. Obviously, you're seeing nature when you're doing, you're exercising when you're doing it, you're taking clean air into your lungs, you're getting an increasing amounts of research is showing that this really has physiological effect on the human being. And of course, why wouldn't it? That's where we arose. That's where we're from. And I think you're right, in a kind of hunting like the mountain hunting for sheep and goat, obviously, there is going to be other elements involved of the challenge and the physicality of the hunt and so on and so forth that's going to matter to people. But of course, there's lots. Sheep hunters don't only hunt sheep. Sheep hunters go on turkey hunts, and sheep hunters go on elk hunts and whitetail hunts, and they fish. I sure know you fish. So in that sense, if we look at it in the collective, what we're really coming to understand is the incredible scale of this. I mean, we have already released, as you know, some fact sheets on the numbers of meals being derived from the harvest of turkeys and bears and white-tailed deer, and we'll soon release one on elk and so on and so forth. Those numbers are incredible. Just the sheer volume, the biomass of food that is being actually taken off the land each year. And we could take more off if we decided to manage the land for wildlife totally. So we could take a hell of a lot more of this wild food off, which I think personally we should. But then you look at our first shearing survey that we conducted in the state of Texas and asked people, well, who did you share your harvest with? And, on average, each hunter was sharing his or her harvest with about 8 people, some more, some a little bit less. But think about that. Let's say that's the average number, and the 40 million hunters and anglers are sharing some part of their catch with 8 people. That means we have 320 million people out of 360 million people between our two countries who actually, bump up against this process, this wild harvesting. And then we add the people gathering the berries and all of the other things, and suddenly we realize that we have the vast majority of people in our societies involved in these beautiful, beautiful activities. And the grandmother that bakes her blueberry pie from wild blueberries is as proud to show that to her family and her brothers and sisters and children and grandchildren as Gray Thornton is to share his elk with his friends and his family. So I really think it's a way of breaking down barriers. And even the people who have spoken to me, and as you know, I interact with lots of anti-hunters, and who say, they still don't accept it. They don't, really want animals to die this way. They want them to live forever, etc. There's such a huge percentage of them that make an exception for this, right? Well, if you're eating it, they mightn't say I like it, but they say, well, if you're eating it, I at least have a harder time, fighting you about this. And ultimately, if we can grow more wildlife through all our collective efforts and provide landscapes with more medicinal plants and more wild berries and more wild mushrooms and give generations the chance to harvest from this, I really think, Gray, we ought to be sort of launching major training sessions to get people to learn how to become hunter-gatherers again. Not just hunters, but gatherers, to know their mushrooms and to know their berries and to know their medicinal plants and all these kinds of things. So I look at the support that the Wild Sheep Foundation has given to this, and this is how I see it. I think that's an example of an organization doing the truly honorable thing. It's doing something for the common good. Yes, it can be beneficial in some ways to the Wild Sheep Foundation, but as you point out, the Wild Sheep Foundation has certain, peculiarities, certain characteristics of the hunts that are undertaken by people. But you're investing in all hunters, Gray, right?
Without question.
From day one, the organization, I never heard a single question of someone say, well, that's a little bit more related to white-tailed deer than it is to maybe mountain sheep. So maybe you ought to go there and talk to them. I didn't hear one comment like that from the Wild Sheep Foundation. And I don't mean just from you, but I mean people on the floors, people in the bars, people everywhere. And that's what it takes, man, to preserve this way of life. And people should not doubt that while we talk about words like hunting and harvesting and so on, ultimately what we are talking about, Gray, is a way of life.
Right. Yeah, and you're not going to get any argument from any sheep hunter, young or old, man or woman, that wild sheep meat tastes exceptional, especially with how difficult it is to obtain. And Shane, you and I chat on little tidbits, and I grab your snippets of wisdom often. And one of them that goes back to your comment on sharing is no one goes out to, or not many anyway, no one goes out to a Safeway or a Costco, or a Rosauers and buys a ham and then just decides to walk over their neighbor and give it to them.
Of course not.
Pretty unusual, but we take an elk, a deer, a sheep, and we love to share it. So it is one of those truisms. We have a challenge within the hunting community, though, and I remember Raleigh Sparrow of the Wildlife Management Institute giving a talk on stage at one of the one, and you were there. I think it was actually one that we met, and he was giving a talk on stage, and it was one of the governor's symposium on hunting heritage. And he went up and asked a question, an audience participation deal. And he says, I would like all the mule deer hunters out there to raise their hands. Half the audience raised their hand. And he says, that's great. Now I'm going to ask you another question. Those of you that raised your hands, how many of you mule deer hunters want to see more mule deer hunters in the field when you're there? Very few hands raised. And and Raleigh's a brilliant guy, and he goes, therein is our problem. We talk about retention and recruitment, and Josh, you had a question on how do we get more sheep hunters involved? And it is a challenge because hunting is in many ways is a solo pursuit. And it's certainly not other than, bird hunting and the like, it's not something, we want the solitude. We want to be out, and sheep hunters in particular, you want to be as far away from anyone. You want that challenge. So it's something that we need to address and deal with. But I think we can. As I like to say, the more sheep hunters, the more interest in wild sheep, the more interest in funding wild sheep conservation, and the more sheep on the mountain. What we often do in our industry is we fight, whether it's allocation, state, provincially, tribally. We fight over allocation. We're fighting over slices of the pie, where we should all be focused, and you've said it, and I like to say it, let's focus on building a bigger pie. And that's what the Wild Sheep Foundation is all about, putting and keeping wild sheep on the mountain. If we have a bigger pie, if there's more sheep on the mountain, Josh, there's more opportunity for regular folks like us to hunt sheep. The unlimited area in Montana, classic situation there. Unlimited permits, limited harvest, but unlimited permits. Wild Sheep Foundation would like to see if we're able to duplicate that in some other areas. We're talking with various agencies on potentially trying that concept on goats. And then eventually on sheep. But to me, that's a way to provide that young guy, that young gal, the opportunity to get out there, to hunt for food, to hunt for the experience, and yes, with a sheep, to hunt that glorious curl that when you touch it, it changes your life.
Well, I think we have to think about hunting too as a global community, and recognize where it starts. Somewhere around 85% of all the international hunters who go to other countries to hunt, let's say go to Africa, go to Central Asia, go to Canada, wherever, about 85% of all those hunters come from the United States of America. Now, the vast majority of the people who are hunting in the United States of America are actually hunting animals that are pretty high up on the list of the food business: pheasants and turkeys and white-tailed deer and elk and so on and so forth. So this is another thing that the world needs to understand. While people may not travel huge distances to hunt a markhor or to hunt Gemsbok or whatever for the sole reason of acquiring meat because they cannot take it back and so on. Nevertheless, what made them the hunters that they are were largely around this kind of familial, odyssey each year of going to deer camp or going to, hunt with their friends for another animal, sharing those meals and so on and so forth. So we have that as a basis for who and what we are. But there's a more fundamental issue here. Why should we not, as nations, be looking at our landscapes as food reservoirs? Why should we not be looking at our rivers as food reservoirs? Why should we not be applying our best science and management to actually increase the amount of wild food that we are producing on those landscapes? And I guarantee you we can do it. We have national forests in the United States that are managed fundamentally for wild berries. That's a very positive thing. And we could take other landscapes that currently do not have as much wildlife as they might have in different parts of both countries. And if we had the ethic that we were going to try to maximize the wild food that's out there, we could do a much better job of producing more wildlife. Not everywhere, Gray, but in a lot of circumstances.
Sure.
And I look at the land and I say, for all the time that we have been a species, the land and waters have been our reservoirs of food. We learned how to capture it. We still know how to do it. And so why shouldn't we be, instead of trying to find alternatives to that, why shouldn't we really be encouraging at a societal level more and more harvesting of that wild food? And the new generations that are arising are telling us that's what they want. They may have purple hair and 2 earrings in their nose or whatever it might be, but that's what they want to have. That's what they want to put in their bodies. That's what they want to feed their children. And we are the ones who have this figured out to be able to help them do exactly that. I mean, the Wild Harvest Initiative, we are now moving into the phase of starting to export the data and communicate the information and build, really strong communication efforts over this with films, with meetings, with various other things. We have the entities like the IUCN and others utilizing our data now. The data that came out of this partnership that Wild Sheep Foundation is such an important part of. And our best way of ever explaining to the world why the North American model was so successful and why it worked and why we succeeded in conserving wildlife ultimately is about harvesting, isn't it? Yeah. And a huge percentage of that harvesting, let's face it, was about eating that animal that we took.
Right.
I mean, how many people shoot an elk and leave it in a ditch?
You don't.
How many people shoot a moose and do that? They don't do it. It's an ethic we just can't accept. We just, you'd have to be an alien to do something of this nature. So I think we really are in the midst of the storytelling that can really take these activities to a much, much higher level. I fundamentally believe it. I think young mothers who enter hunting are entering it with a very, very health conscious mind.
You bet. Andrew, I see we've got a few questions. I know we've got just a few minutes more, but maybe if you can direct.
Yeah. Thanks for such an invigorating conversation. We have a number of questions, and I want to remind people that they can also submit more on that Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. But Shane, I think this is for you. You just talked about moving from the data generation and accumulation stage to now communicating what you've learned. Jen asks, what are your thoughts on engaging, informing, training celebrities, both conservative and liberal, to be ambassadors or influencers of to their own audiences?
Yeah, I lost you a little bit, but I can see most of the writing there, Andrew. I think influencers, as they're called in the social media world, can be very impactful. There can be sometimes a little bit of backlash against celebrities, standing for things, just because some people criticize and say, what do they really know about something of this nature? So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, but we are about to present to the communications team with Wild Harvest, of which Gray is a part. We are about to release a 2-phase communication strategy that's been developed by a large company for us that has had input from the members of the Wild Harvest Alliance. And one component of it relies fundamentally on our own activities as agencies, say Wild Sheep Foundation or an Elk Foundation or whoever, Conservation Visions. But to the question, and to Jen's question specifically, We are also in the second phase of it looking at what we're calling portals or influencers who we could find that would actually take this information. The portals could be people who take it into institutions, and the influencers would be the people who could take it and multiply the message out to the publics. So I think that's what Jen may be thinking about, but she also mentions about training some of those celebrities. And I think that's a very good point because, you know, they have to know what they're talking about as well to be effective in communicating this.
Thanks for that. Tom has asked, when will the wild harvest data be available to the public?
Well, some of the data is already available to the public. We report to our partners 4 times a year, which gives them updates on the data that we're gathering and the analyses that we're running and so on and so forth. And we're starting to release the information in what we call fact sheets, which are based on individual species. And we will eventually have a fact sheet on almost every species that is harvested in Canada and the United States. And of course, we can produce those by jurisdiction or by continent. Right now, we're producing them by continent, you know, all pheasants harvested, all turkeys harvested, whatever. And that is going to be one of the first ways that this information starts to come out. But we also are developing much more detailed reports that are being submitted to conventions, scientific bodies, which will eventually be published. And we are also, of course, heavily communicating through social media. So if someone is interested and they want to come to the Conservation Visions website, for example, or our Wild Harvest Initiative website, there is information there. And they can also come further to, you know, directly to us, to staff and so on and so forth, and get further information. I'll tell you something that's really exciting. We now are the only group in the world that know the full list of even species that are harvested in Canada and the United States by recreational hunters and anglers. Before that, we didn't even have a complete list. And by we, nobody, not the US Fish and Wildlife Service, not the Canadian Wildlife Service, nobody. We are the only ones who also know the numbers of animals for 4 years of data now that we've compiled. We're working on the 5th. The total number of animals by species in every jurisdiction and across the continent. And we also now know the number of meals because we have researched the body proportions and the consumable weights of every single one of those species. We now have that information available too. And within about 3 months, we are going to be completing the analysis of all recreational fishing in Canada, which will be a review of about 30 years of data for all species, freshwater and marine, that are recreationally taken in that country, and will, in fact, essentially draw a line under the total food provisioning of recreational fishing in that entire country. So we're really moving quickly on this. So there's a lot of information available. We do try to move this information in a regimented way to our partners first, to the organizations that have supported it, financed it, made it happen. Those are the entities that we try naturally to give the previews to, if you will. And then we're releasing these fact sheets, as I said, to the general public, and they're released through press releases and so on and so forth.
This is a question I think would be best directed really to either of you. The title of this presentation is Changing the Narrative around this North American conversation. Is there anything that we as hunters or as conservationists need to do to change our vocabulary when we talk about hunting and harvesting and sort of the semantic part that goes with that?
Gray, maybe you could take the lead on that.
Boy, Andrew, that's $1 million question. And, the term trophy, there's been has been, I guess, and still is a movement that we need to change that term. But I don't know what that gains us. I guess I go back to we keep getting wrapped up in jargon and thinking that we can come up with some bumper sticker statement that will change the narrative. And I just don't know if that's gonna work, and for the term trophy, to many of us, it is a trophy. But it's not a trophy from a football trophy or a baseball trophy or a track trophy. It's a trophy of experience. It's a trophy of the challenges that we faced, and then if there's a harvest of the accomplishment of that. So I don't know. I know, Shane and I debate this quite a bit. Our director of marketing and communication, Keith Balford, is very articulate on this as well, and I enjoy visiting with him on it. I think we need to go deeper, and I think that's a lot of what the Wild Harvest Initiative can give to us is that connection to the wild. So we don't get caught up in some fad that we're going to we're going to come up with some new name for trophy or some new way to justify what we do. I think what we really need to focus on is eliminating.
We lost your audio there, Gray.
Gray is muted there.
While we're waiting to get Gray back online, Shane, Josh asked that initial question that Gray did a marvelous job of talking about changing some of the participation of these highly limited Western draw hunts and talked about expanding maybe the unlimited model. But the question really was, is there a violation of some sense of the North American model because of this extremely limited draw odds? And then Josh continues, it is discouraging new hunters since they're so far behind the point curve. What can be done to continue to encourage new hunters and especially new sheep hunters? Any perspective from you on that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's reasonable for people to wonder when they see some of the prices that are paid for these special tags to say, well, that's something that kind of eliminates me from the process. But not all sheep hunting, of course, is designated to those very high-end, very expensive tags. Some are, but obviously, there's places where you can go and buy an over-the-counter tag and go hunt sheep, if you want to hunt sheep. So it is not like this is a completely exclusionary process for all sheep hunters, but for some of those permits, it definitely is excluding quite a number of people from bidding on those particular ones. I think the safeguard or the benefit associated with that, however, is the arrangements that have been made over time, and they have evolved to some extent, to enable the money or to force the money to be channeled back into the conservation of the species itself. So this is a very large expenditure, and only a small handful of people are able to actually successfully bid on something like that for the big tags. But that money does a tremendous amount of good. So the idea that the free access, if you will, or equitable access to hunting as it's enshrined in the North American model, that is completely, sort of done away with or destroyed by some of these exceptional efforts that are very specific programs to specific areas with one or two sheep or whatever it might be, a governor's tag or something of this nature. I don't really see that as destroying or undermining the model. I think if that was extended across the board in saying, highest bidder gets the elk tags, highest bidder gets the turkey tags, highest bidder gets the something. If we went very close down that road, I think this will be a much, much greater concern. Or if the money that was raised on these special tags was not devoted to the conservation efforts of the animals themselves. I mean, under any program, there are certain circumstances where you have to try to innovate, you have to try to make change. Now, the hunting community is a democratic institution. People are free to, express their views and be critical of things that they don't like and to raise issues. And I'm not saying it isn't an issue that can be raised. I'm saying from where I sit, and in terms of the continuance of the North American model, we have to be careful not to go very far down this road in a comprehensive way, but to have a few of those things that stick out that do particularly, really good things by providing large amounts of money for a particular species that has not, after all, recovered to the extent that some of the other species have, like white-tailed deer and like elk and so on and so forth, and maybe can be argued needs some more help for a variety of reasons. So I tend to take that view of that process. I neither condemn those approaches, the special tags, but nor would I recommend that become a really expansive, very common thing, that we sort of take the principle of sell something for the highest bid, and turn that to be the standard for wildlife access in Canada and the United States. That I would be opposed to.
Hey, Andrew, I'm back
Sorry.
on. Maybe I can add a little bit to that. And I must have spilled beer on my my audio system of some sort. But Josh, I'm there with you. I'm not necessarily a young guy. I'm 59. But there's a dynamic, and I've seen it for 30 years in this industry. If I go north and go to a Wild Sheep Foundation chapter in Alberta, or if I go to the Wild Sheep Society of BC, it's interesting to see the age difference of a Canadian sheep organization versus a US. And I'll tell you, the reason is opportunity. Opportunity for that young guy or gal to do, in effect, an over-the-counter sheep hunt, like he or she could do with the deer, an elk or any other species. So that kind of ties into what I was talking about and that unlimited model, where you have the opportunity to have a sheep tag in your pocket. So how are we going to do that? And I'll tell you, there's barriers to it. Our director, our vice president of conservation, Kevin Hurley, and I were trying to work in Wyoming on opening up a sliver of one of the units as an unlimited area, so we could bring in more aspirational sheep hunters into this game, into our family. And there's resistance from that, from the agency side, but there's resistance from that from the hunter side. It's kind of like Raleigh Sparrow's question of the mule deer. You had people going, no, there's 250 tags allocated in the state of Wyoming. You're not going to take 2 or 3 out of that pool and put them into this unlimited area. So it's going to take a thought process. But I'll go back to building a bigger pie. Let's all get together and build a bigger pie. Let's put more sheep on the mountain. Then we can start talking about allocating them. To Shane's point, kind of a funny one. Shane and I love to give speeches around the world. And I, in some of my speeches in the past, had talked about this special permit and tag model that we have within the wild sheep economy as a bastardization of the North American wildlife conservation model, because it is an egalitarian system. And the high bidder is the one in a non-egalitarian system to get the tag. And Shane, you and I were floating in my drift boat down the Yellowstone River, and we were seeing elk, and we had seen sheep, and we had seen ducks, and we'd seen the wildlife. And I don't think we fished much, we just pontificated. And you had pointed out, I think it was after lunch and maybe a glass of wine or two, and we're still rowing down the river. And you said, you know, Gray, I've heard you talk a number of times about this bastardization of the North American model, and you're wrong. And I'm wrong many, many times. But you pointed out to me that a state, a province, a territory, a tribe, a First Nation under the North American model has the ability to determine how they fund wildlife conservation. And in the particular case of these limited auction tags, we know as the Wild Sheep Foundation, we did a study of Western Association and Fish and Wildlife Agency data in 2014, that 74%, and I'll say it again, 74% of all sheep conservation funding directed to agencies comes from either an auction tag or a raffle tag. 74%. You know, a little gratuitous plug for the Sheep Foundation, 40% of those dollars come from our organization. But here's the grind, and here's the benefit of that. I was able to take a bighorn sheep in Montana in 2014 as a Wyoming resident in an unlimited area. Unbelievable luck. I mean, the success rate is 2 to 3%. Better to be lucky than good. I was lucky. I'm not that good of a sheep hunter. My tag cost 750 bucks. It's a lot of money, but 750 bucks. The year prior to me hunting that tag, we had sold the Montana bighorn tag for $480,000. There's a lot of people mad about that. Well, that money, 90% of it goes back to Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. 10% stays with Wild Sheep Foundation, which we drive right back into conservation. And my comment was, instead of a class warfare for that guy or gal that wants to spend his or her money on wild sheep conservation, and that's where it's going, I thank God for that person, because that person is that 74%, and that person enabled me, a regular guy, to buy a $750 over-the-counter tag and go hunting in Montana. So it's an interesting dynamic in the wild sheep economy. Josh, your question is fabulous. It's a challenging one because there's so many different dynamics that it affects. But the big picture, let's put more sheep on the mountain. Then we can worry and talk about how we allocate them.
Well, if you thought that was a pernicious question, I've got one that really cuts to the heart, I think, of some of the value and valuation of wild protein. Tom asks, and he cites some of the, Shane, you mentioned some of the other cultures and the global phenomenon of people getting their heads around this. Tom mentions that many countries in Europe allow for the sale of wild game in commercial settings, and asks, do we need to think about overcoming or evolving our laws and mindsets in North America to allow game meat to be allowed to be sold in order for more folks, and Tom says those in the middle, to have the opportunity to eat wild game? What are your thoughts, Shane?
I've long believed that the North American model has strings on it the same as a guitar, and by bending and moving those strings, you can play certain chords and you'll get certain sounds. I don't believe that those chords or those strings are made of concrete. We had a process which I opened up this evening's discussion with. We had a process where wildlife was being absolutely obliterated on this continent. If we had an Endangered Species Act in 1910, 1920, most of the species that you recognize today would have been on it. We didn't have it. And so we didn't want to give up harvesting. And we didn't want to stop the individual person, citizen, from being able to harvest. But we had to do something. We had to put limits on that harvest. And the best way and most effective way to put limits on that harvest, of course, was to limit the sale so that people wouldn't be shooting a lot of animals just for profit. They could only kill so many to eat. And that took place at a time when there were very few state agencies. Took place at a time where law enforcement was in its absolute infancy. Took place at a time where science was very minimal. Took place at a time when there were no funding mechanisms. Took place at a time when there were, in fact, really not even any university courses or programs that you could take to study wildlife management. It wasn't until the 1930s and Leopold's efforts and so on and so forth that that really started in North America. So I have always held to the position that if somebody can show me a better way, then I'm fully prepared to write a new book on the North American model and call it the new North American model, the better way to conserve wildlife. One of the advantages of being able to sell wild meat under much better enforcement circumstances and traceability and science and all of that is, just as the individual raising the questions points out, it would introduce a great many people to the value of that resource. And the more people who care about that resource, the more likely we are to keep it. The more likely we are as private citizens to stand up to large industrial takings of land and things of this nature, for example, which we all know is a phenomenon in modern society. So my personal view is this, and I have proposed this on a number of occasions. I think we should run an experiment with this idea of selling meat. I don't think we should change the laws tomorrow to apply to every state in the union, but I think we should look at some kind of very tightly controlled activity where it might be possible for the single mother living in an urban center who is never going to have the chance to hunt herself or is never going to know somebody who is able to give her that meat, that she might have the chance to have access to that and say, you know what? That wildlife I don't see is part of my food provisioning, part of my food security. And therefore I want it protected. So I am not in favor of simply unleashing this kind of commercial idea to the world. And there are a lot of colleagues who are very much opposed to any kind of, thought about doing this. But, we have superabundant species, which we didn't have certainly in the 1920s. We have snow geese, we have Canada geese, we have white-tailed deer in some circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. And why should we not harvest those animals and make that meat available at some cost, to people who might want it? So I'm actually in favor of experimenting with this, this principle of the model that a lot of people feel we should just absolutely stay away from.
Thanks. And thank you both for such an invigorating discussion. This was fascinating. Shane, I'd like you to close us out. And before you do, just a reminder to listeners that this content will be available on this platform for another month through mid-February. So share it, consume it. Thank you both for.
I missed a little bit of what you said there, but I think, Andrew, you sort of turned it over to me. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Well, first of all, my thank you to everyone who was on this webinar. And my thank you to the Wild Sheep Foundation for having, frankly, the courage to adopt this new kind of platform as an attempt to communicate under the circumstances of COVID and all that that means. I think it is possible for us to continue doing these kinds of things and reach a lot of people and bring more people who might not be able to attend a wild sheep convention or a SCI convention or an elk convention or whatever, and bring them into these discussions about these really fundamental issues. So I think I'm very happy to have seen that this took place, and I was very happy to be able to at least provide a couple of windows, Gray, that we
Mhm.
could have this, and also to share some of the films that we've been doing, and I really hope to do a lot more of this in the future. On Wild Harvest, I will simply say this. It is a pattern in human society that we often have to draw back to leap. We go far, far away from the origins of something and then realize that we've suddenly turned around, that realize we've really left something very, very special behind us. And the only way for us to get it back is to go back and retrieve some of that idea, some of that thinking, some of that material, some of that insight, and to make a run towards the future like a man crossing a stream, stepping back to leap over it. I fundamentally believe that if we cannot convince modern society to accept hunting, then there will be terrible prices to pay for wildlife in many parts of the world. And there will be a tragic loss of cultures that really matter a great deal to people in very, very different places, Montana versus Newfoundland and everywhere else. It's the culture of story, and it's the culture of food, and it's the culture of friendship, and it's the culture of family, and it's the culture of loving the outdoors. And therefore, we need to find the best way to make sure that that never happens. If society writ large turns on hunting and really decides at 80 to 90% that they do not want to have it in this world anymore, we will not have it. And every piece of evidence that we have gathered in the past, and every piece of evidence that has come forward as we have unleashed this Wild Harvest Initiative, and we have broken new ground on so many fronts with this work. Every piece of evidence we gather only strengthens the idea that society is behind us on this. Young society, young people, the very people we need to find. And when I sit in a little office in St. John's, Newfoundland, and I have the government of the United Arab Emirates, and I have the IUCN scientific processes, and I have government agencies in Hungary, and I have international funding institutions that work in Africa primarily coming to me and saying, how did you ever do this? We must make this our message. I'm convinced that this is going to go global. And I think the reason it's going to go global is because it is touching on the ancient part of our humanities. And when we go back there, whether it is watching a fire, or walking a dog, or watching a dog work, or just being out and lying under the stars, something different happens. And we are going to have to cultivate this story, this narrative, this data. And while it's great, as I said, for people to have game dinners and things of this nature, we have to have the evidence. We have to have the knowledge from which our arguments can be fashioned. And the Wild Harvest Initiative has taken on an almost impossible task of bringing all of that together. I don't have a team of 50 people. This is a murderous process of work, and yet we have it. And now, of course, we see even groups like the National Forest Service wanting to come to us with their data on berries and salmon and firewood and all these other things. So I'm just grateful that enough people like Gray, but as Gray knows, there are others too who stepped up and took the time to think about this and then decided to fund it in the way they did. Because I can guarantee you, if Gray and many others had been token about this, had simply said, oh, we'll put $5,000 into this or something, if there had been a token kind of effort made like that by this partnership, we'd have none of this that we have today. And we are about to launch on the American and Canadian people and the governments of states and provinces an unbelievable, undeniable set of information that they're going to have to deal with and figure out what it means and how they can help keep this going. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Shane. Thank you for supporting Sheep Week, the experience.
Well
We
done.
came for the Guinness, man. Good night to you.
Cheers.
Take care of yourselves. All the
Cheers.
best.
Good night.
Enjoy your evening.